Welcome, dear listeners, to another captivating mystery. Before we begin today's story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss a new release. We post 2 gripping audiobooks every week, filled with suspense, secrets, and unforgettable characters. Your support helps us bring these stories to life, and your comments and thoughts are always welcome. Now settle in and let's begin today's mystery. Murder at Ravenleigh Hall. Chapter 1. The Letter from Hampshire. It was a busy Monday morning in late October, and the offices of Scotland Yard were busy as usual. Inspector Harold Price sat at his desk, trimming the end of a cigar he would not light until dusk. His gaze, as always, was sharp, one that had learned to read more in silence than in words. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. "Come in," Price said. A young constable entered, his boots wet from the pavement outside. "A letter for you, sir. Arrived by special courier." Price took the thick envelope and noted the sender's name with raised eyebrows. Sir Cedric Greaves, Ravenleigh Hall, Hampshire. Sir Cedric was not unknown to him. A renowned physicist, Greaves had once advised the Ministry of Defence and was rumoured to be working on a new form of energy transmission. Reclusive, eccentric, and sharp-tongued, he had withdrawn from public life 5 years ago and had not surfaced since. Intrigued, Price opened the letter and began to read. "My dear Inspector Price, though we have not met in person, I believe you will recall my name from your investigation into the Lancing Clock Tower incident some years ago. I write to you now, not out of vanity, but urgency. There is, I fear, a danger within my household. Not a threat of violence, necessarily, but of sabotage, betrayal, perhaps even the prospect of murder. I dare not trust the local authorities. Too many eyes, too many mouths. I implore you to come to Ravenleigh Hall at once, under the pretence of advising me on security. Time is of the essence. Yours in confidence, Sir Cedric Greaves." Price tapped the letter against his palm thoughtfully. Scientists were not usually given to melodrama. That Sir Cedric would reach out directly, circumventing officials, suggested more than paranoia. The man must have suspected someone close to him. He left that afternoon, boarding the 3:30 express from Waterloo, bound for the Hampshire countryside. The landscape changed swiftly as the train left London's grime behind, trading factory chimneys and alleyways for rolling hills, skeletal trees, and the quiet decay of rural autumn. At the small station of Alvercombe, a liveried man was waiting with a dark green motor car. "Inspector Price?" he asked, tipping his cap. "I'm Harris, Sir Cedric's chauffeur. He asked me to fetch you." "How is Sir Cedric?" Price asked as he climbed in. Harris hesitated before starting the engine. He was well this morning, sir, but I'm afraid something's happened." Price's eyes narrowed. "What sort of something?" "Sir Cedric was found in his study just an hour ago. Dead, sir. Locked from the inside. No signs of struggle. The doctor's there now, but they say it may have been poison." Price stared ahead, already shifting his thoughts from suspicion to certainty. Sir Cedric had feared murder. Now he was dead. The car had finally reached Ravenleigh Hall. It was a vast, brooding structure of dark stone, with arched windows, a crooked central tower, and ivy choking much of the southern wall. The house exhaled wealth, but not warmth. It felt like a place designed for genius and perhaps madness. Price stepped out as a housemaid in black opened the heavy oak door. "Inspector," she whispered, eyes wide. "This way, please." They led him through a dim hallway, lined with portraits, and into a study at the back of the house. It was a curious room, half library, half laboratory. Mechanical diagrams littered one desk. Books of chemistry and mathematics were stacked haphazardly. At the centre lay Sir Cedric, slumped over his chair, his face frozen in mid-expression. His lips were slightly parted, and his eyes stared past the brass clock on the mantelpiece. A portly country doctor stood near the fireplace. "Inspector Price, I presume?" Price nodded. "Dr. Emery." "Yes, Been tending to the household for years. I'm afraid the poor man's gone. The door was locked from the inside. We had to break it down. Any signs of poison? There's the smell, almonds. You know what that suggests. Cyanide. The doctor nodded grimly. Possibly administered in his drink. There's a cup of black coffee by his side. Untouched food he hadn't eaten. Price walked over to the coffee cup and sniffed. He turned to the butler, who now stood silently in the doorway. Who prepared this? Mrs. Glade, the cook, but the tray was carried in by Lady Margaret. Lady Margaret? His wife, sir. Price's brow lifted. Sir Cedric's wife, he recalled, was over 20 years his junior. A former actress with an enigmatic past. He made a mental note to get the cup sent for testing. How many people are in the house? He continued. 7 guests and 4 servants. Sir Cedric had invited them all for the week. Said he was going to unveil something. Unveil what? No one knows. He kept it secret. Said it would change the future of science. Price glanced again at the lifeless body of Sir Cedric Greaves. Whatever discovery the man had intended to reveal, someone had ensured he would take it to the grave. Chapter 2. The Guests of Ravenleigh Hall. Inspector Price stood near the cold hearth of Sir Cedric's study, his eyes fixed on the polished brass clock atop the mantel. It read 3:08, frozen, perhaps deliberately, or simply neglected. Price asked that a list of all the people in the household be presented to him. The butler, Withers, a gaunt man, with the bearing of a retired colonel, nodded. He quickly made a list with the details Price requested. Yes, sir. Here is the list ready for you. Price took the slip of paper from Withers and glanced down. It read, Lady Margaret Greaves, wife of the deceased. Price scribbled his own note next to it, writing down, former stage actress. Charles Greaves, nephew of Sir Cedric, recently returned from the continent. Miss Eleanor Bray, Sir Cedric's scientific assistant. Dr. Hugo Venn, visiting chemist, longtime colleague of Sir Cedric. Mrs. Isadora Blaine, friend of Lady Margaret, fashionable and gossipy. Mr. Felix Langham, solicitor to Sir Cedric. Alfred Kemp, a quiet man, said to be an observer from the ministry. Have them assembled in the drawing room, Price instructed. I'll speak to them one by one. The drawing room was a high-ceilinged chamber of damask curtains and antique furniture, its walls adorned with hunting trophies and oil portraits. As Price entered, 7 faces turned toward of him, each with a different expression: curiosity, fear, annoyance, and in one case, faint amusement. He introduced himself simply. I am Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard. I have been summoned here under circumstances you are no doubt all aware of. Sir Cedric Greaves is dead. The matter appears suspicious. I intend to ask each of you a few questions. You may be assured that your cooperation is expected. A rustle of discomfort moved through the room. Lady Margaret rose from the chaise lounge. She wore deep violet silk, with not a strand of her raven black hair out of place. Her beauty was of the kind that made people speak softly in her presence. Inspector, this is a dreadful shock to all of us. Cedric was in fine spirits this morning. He'd just come from his laboratory. Did he mention what he was working on? Price asked. Lady Margaret hesitated. Only that it would revolutionize something. Electricity, perhaps, or motion. I don't know much of such things. He was secretive, intensely so. Price studied her eyes, calm, controlled, grieving perhaps, but if so, with poise honed on the London stage. Did you bring him his coffee? I did, she said smoothly. He asked for it. I carried it in myself, on a tray from the kitchen. I placed it beside him. He barely acknowledged me, and I left. That was just after 1 o'clock. Did anyone else touch the tray? I don't believe so. Ask Cook if you must. It's always coffee after his midday walk. Price nodded. Thank you, Lady Greaves. Please remain available for further questions. She inclined her head slightly and sat down again, her fingers tightening for just a moment around the folds of her gown. Charles Greaves came next, tall, lean and restless, with sunken eyes and a tremor he tried to disguise by fidgeting with a gold cigarette case. "You are his nephew," Price said. "Living here?" No, Charles replied, flicking open the case. "I've been abroad, France mostly. I arrived 2 days ago. He invited me, said he wanted to talk about legacy, the estate. I thought he meant to put things in order." "You didn't get along?" Charles laughed bitterly. "That's generous. He despised me, thought me lazy, unworthy. Which, fair enough. I've lived poorly and borrowed foolishly. But blood is blood, Inspector. He was all the family I had left." Price noted the nicotine-stained fingers, the slight slur in his voice. "Did you see him today?" "Yes, briefly. Around noon. He was agitated, accused me of prying through his papers, which I hadn't done. Yet. Then he stormed off to the study." "You didn't see him after that?" "No," Charles stood abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, this house stinks of the grave." Miss Eleanor Bray was quite the opposite. She was composed, plainly dressed in a grey tweed skirt and blouse, with her hair pinned tightly in a no-nonsense bun. She held a notebook in her lap and did not stand when Price addressed her. "I was Sir Cedric's assistant for 6 years," she said simply. "He trusted me with every technical detail, but not with his invention. Not entirely. He'd grown suspicious lately. Secretive." "Did he fear someone?" "Yes, he told me so. He even changed the locks on his laboratory." "Did you know what he planned to unveil?" "Not exactly. I believe it had to do with gyroscopic motion and self-sustaining energy. He wouldn't allow me near the final model. It was kept under a tarp in the East Wing." "Could that invention have commercial value?" Miss Bray looked up, eyes sharp. "It could change everything, Inspector. Motors, weaponry, travel, power. It would be worth a fortune." A motive, Price thought. Motive enough for several in the room. Dr. Hugo Venn had the weary arrogance of a man who had known genius and chosen enmity. With his bushy eyebrows, dishevelled cravat, and wine-stained waistcoat, he looked more like a disgraced professor than a guest of honour. "Cedric and I were friends once," he told Price gruffly. "Then rivals, then something worse." "You were invited?" "He summoned me with the same dramatic flair he always had. Promised I'd witness something epoch-making. I assumed it was another of his boasts." "And you came anyway?" "I was curious, and I wanted to see the man beaten by his own hubris, if I'm honest." "You're a chemist, Dr. Venn?" "Yes. You suspect poison?" "I suspect opportunity." Venn smiled bitterly. "Well then, you'll have your hands full in this house." The remaining interviews were more superficial. Mrs. Isadora Blaine, a socialite, appeared more annoyed at the inconvenience than distressed by the death. Mr. Felix Langham, the solicitor, was tight-lipped and professional, revealing little emotion. And Mr. Alfred Kemp, the so-called observer from the ministry, gave evasive answers about his presence, claiming to be there only to observe the patent process. By dusk, Inspector Price had assembled more questions than answers. Ravenleigh Hall was filled with secrets, some scientific, others personal, and Sir Cedric Greaves had been at the centre of it all. He returned to the study as the sun fell behind the trees. The room was dim now, lit only by the firelight and the faint ticking of a mantel clock. Price sat in the late inventor's chair, letting the silence settle. The murderer, he knew, was in this house, and like all murderers, they believed their plan had been perfect. But they had not counted on him. Chapter 3. The Locked Door and the Missing Device. The following morning, Inspector Price had rose early, declining breakfast in favour of a second inspection of Sir Cedric's study, now sealed off from the rest of the household. He entered with his hands clasped behind his back, moving slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the chamber. He stopped at the heavy oak door, still bearing splinters where it had been forced open the day before. Withers, the butler, had confirmed the door had been locked from the inside. The key had been discovered in the lock, on the inside. The single casement window had been shut and latched as well. "Quite the puzzle," muttered Price. The room was unmistakably a fusion of mind and machinery. The large mahogany desk bore the scars of years of invention: ink blots, tiny chemical burns, brass shavings. Nearby, a broad work table was covered with blueprints, gears, tubes and wires, all carefully arranged in a precise but eccentric order. At the centre of the room, the armchair where Sir Cedric had died still remained, now draped in a white sheet, though Price had had the body removed the evening before. The scent of coffee and bitter almonds still faintly clung to the air, a toxic bouquet. Dr. Emery had provided the provisional cause of death, hydrogen cyanide poisoning, but the means of delivery remained unknown. Price walked to the fireplace, where the cold ashes of the morning's fire sat undisturbed. Above the mantel, the brass clock ticked on softly. It had not been stopped after all, merely rewound improperly. Price adjusted it absently, noting the small screwdriver lying beside it. On the far wall stood a curious cabinet, taller than a man, painted black, with brass fittings. Inside, several compartments held miniature mechanisms, but what truly caught Price's attention was an empty pedestal in the middle, where dust outlines indicated something had recently stood, something cylindrical and moderately large. He called in Withers. "Yes, sir?" "Did you or anyone remove any devices or machines from this room since the death?" Withers blinked. "No, sir. Everything was left precisely as it was. Lady Margaret and Miss Bray ensured no one entered until you arrived." Price frowned. "Then something was taken before the death, or immediately after." He gestured to the empty pedestal. "What belonged there?" The butler hesitated. "I believe it was part of Sir Cedric's final experiment, sir. A self-winding device, clockwork, but more intricate. I'd seen it once, about the size of a bread box, gleaming brass and copper, but it's been kept under lock and key in recent weeks." "And where was it last seen?" "In the East Wing workshop, sir, but no one has been allowed in there. Sir Cedric kept the key on him at all times." Price nodded, made a note, and excused Withers. The key, of course, had not been found among the inventor's personal items. Later that morning, Price made his way to the East Wing, a quieter part of the house, used only by Sir Cedric. Miss Eleanor Bray accompanied him, carrying a ring of substitute keys she had access to. The long corridor leading to the workshop was dim and narrow. At the end stood a metal door unlike any other in the house. Price inserted the key, and with a slow turn, the lock gave way. The door creaked open. What lay beyond was a vision of mechanical genius. The room was filled with strange inventions, some half-finished, others ticking away, in perpetual motion. Brass gears spun silently in glass boxes, small devices clicked and whirred, and a low electric hum vibrated beneath the floorboards. Cedric called it his cradle of precision, Miss Bray murmured. In the centre stood a wooden workbench, and on it an empty, velvet-lined case, the exact size and shape to match the missing object from the study. "There it is," said Price. "The device was here." "Yes, and taken." He turned to Miss Bray. "Could anyone else enter this room?" "Only Sir Cedric, and myself when permitted. But I've not been allowed inside for over a week." He was growing secretive, paranoid. "Was the device dangerous?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But he did say once, if it falls into the wrong hands, the consequences would be severe." Price turned toward a small burner table near the corner, where chemical flasks and measuring tubes were arranged. Something on the surface caught his eye. A metal stirring rod, stained pale blue at the tip. "Cyanide compound," he muttered. "Prepared here." He now had a working theory. The poison had been prepared in this workshop. The device, the clockwork machine, had somehow been used to deliver it. It was no longer simply a case of murder. It was a calculated killing, one tied to an invention of significant value, now missing. Returning to the drawing room, Price found Charles Greaves lounging with a cigarette, tossing a coin between his fingers. "Tell me, Charles," Price said calmly, "were you in the East Wing at all yesterday?" Charles laughed. God, no, my uncle would have skinned me alive if I so much as breathed on his sacred workshop. What about last night? I was in my room drinking away the awkwardness. Ask anyone. I will. He turned next to Lady Margaret, who was reading by the window in a soft yellow chair. Did Sir Cedric keep his invention in the East Wing? Yes, but he refused to discuss it, said no one would understand it until it was unveiled. And that was to happen this week. She nodded. He said Friday night, a private demonstration. Miss Bray told me the invention could have political or military implications. Do you agree? She gave a slight smile. My husband was a genius, but also a showman. He thrived on drama. I wouldn't be surprised if the invention was just another of his illusions. But someone believed in it enough to kill for it, Price said quietly. Lady Margaret's gaze did not waver. Then I suggest you find out who. By late afternoon, the sky outside had turned gunmetal grey. Inspector Price returned once more to the study. He stood before the empty pedestal where the machine had once sat. The invention was missing. The poison had been delivered with precision. And one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The killer had not simply wanted to silence Sir Cedric Greaves. They had wanted to steal his legacy. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Laboratory. Inspector Harold Price stood alone in Sir Cedric's laboratory, now the object of his full attention. It was no ordinary laboratory. Everything here had the mark of obsession. The custom-built shelves, the precisely arranged beakers, the calibrated weights, and rows of formulae scrawled on a wall-length blackboard in perfect copperplate script. There was genius here, yes, but also control and perhaps madness. The tools of invention could so easily be turned to destruction. Price's eye fell again on the burner table, where the pale blue staining on the stirrer suggested cyanide had been recently synthesized. But there was something new now. In the flickering light, he noticed a faint dust ring on the floor. Round, flat, about the size of a wide-brimmed hat. A missing object had sat here until very recently. Not just the machine, he murmured. Something else was taken. He crouched and inspected the floor more closely. The pattern was faint, but the absence of dust and grime was unmistakable. He made a chalk outline and noted it in his journal. Just then the door creaked open and Miss Eleanor Bray stepped in, clutching a stack of papers. Her coat was damp from the corridor, and she looked paler than usual. "You sent for me, Inspector?" "Yes," said Price. "You said you were not allowed in this room for the past week." "That's right. And yet I find it difficult to believe that in 6 years you didn't make any copies or notes about Sir Cedric's final project. Did he dictate everything to you verbally?" Miss Bray flushed. "No, I was trusted, and I did keep notes, but I never dared look at the final schematics. He locked those away." She held out the stack in her hand. "These are from earlier phases. You'll see, the designs were for something remarkably compact. A kinetic engine, wound by motion. Self-sustaining, theoretically." Price flipped through the pages, his eyes moving swiftly over the intricate diagrams and handwritten annotations. Everything pointed to something revolutionary, yet not quite complete. "And you believe the final version, the one that's now missing, worked?" "Yes," she said, her voice quieter now. "Sir Cedric told me he tested it successfully last Thursday." "Was anyone else present?" "No, he insisted on secrecy." Price nodded, then paused. "Miss Bray, forgive the question, but what was the true nature of your relationship with Sir Cedric?" Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon? You lived here, you worked closely. There are those who might think—" She cut him off, calm but firm. "There was nothing improper. Sir Cedric valued my intellect, not my companionship. I was his confidant in science, not in sentiment." "Not even jealousy, then?" "Certainly not." Her mouth thinned. "If anything, I pitied Lady Margaret." "Why?" Miss Bray hesitated. "Because Cedric had no room in his life for devotion, only for brilliance. She was kept like a decorative piece on a chessboard." Price said nothing, but noted the bitterness behind her carefully controlled voice. "That evening, After supper, Price asked to see Lady Margaret once more, this time in the library. She arrived with deliberate grace, dressed in black velvet, her pearl earrings a subtle defiance of mourning. She stood by the hearth without invitation, and met Price's gaze coolly. "You wish to question me again, Inspector?" "Yes, I have a few lingering uncertainties." "Don't we all?" Price studied her. "Lady Margaret, how well did you understand your husband's work?" "Not in the slightest. He spoke in riddles, equations, and metaphors." I smiled and nodded. "Did that trouble you?" "It bored me," she said, swirling a glass of port. "But I had comforts. Travel, article occasional freedom. I did not need to understand him to benefit from him." "And yet you brought him his coffee." "I did. Is that suspicious now?" "It's unusual," Price said. "He had a housemaid for such tasks. Yet you, his wife, delivered the drink yourself, on the very day he was killed. Did you pour it?" "No, I took it as it was served by the cook. I don't even like the smell of coffee." "And you saw nothing else in the study?" "No, he waved me away. I believe he was irritated with me for opening a telegram that had arrived earlier." "What telegram?" "I assumed it was routine. I opened it in error. But he was furious, snatched it from my hand." "Did you read it?" "Only the first few words. Something about a scheduled visit from a Mr. M on Friday." "Mr. M?" ? "I thought it might be someone from the government. Cedric had dealings in that direction before." Price made a mental note to retrieve that telegram. It could be crucial. The following morning, Price visited Alfred Kemp, the ministry man, in his guest quarters. Kemp was tidy, with smooth brown hair and a forgettable face. He had unpacked nothing. His case sat by the bed, as though he had planned to leave the moment his duties ended. "Mr. Kemp," Price began, "your purpose here has not yet been fully clarified." "I was to act as witness," Kemp replied. "Sir Cedric had requested a representative from the ministry to observe his demonstration on Friday." "Did he say what he had invented?" "No specifics, only that it concerned perpetual motion." "And what was your government's interest in that?" Kemp shrugged. "If it works, it changes everything. Fuel, transport, industry. Imagine a machine that never runs out." "Yes," Price said flatly. "Imagine." He turned for the door, then paused. "Mr. Kemp, if you were to bet on who among the guests might want Sir Cedric dead, who would you choose?" Kemp offered a dry smile. "I would never speculate, Inspector. But you have a thought?" After a long pause, Kemp said, "Charles Greaves." "The nephew. I saw him speaking with Lady Margaret late at night, and I saw him pocket something from Sir Cedric's study on Sunday evening." "What sort of something?" "I couldn't say. It looked like a key." Price immediately sent for Charles and asked him to meet him outside the stables under the guise of a private conversation. The air was sharp with the scent of wet hay and wood smoke. The inspector didn't waste time. "Charles," he said, "were you in possession of a key to the East Wing workshop?" The younger man stiffened. "No." "Don't lie." Charles hesitated. "I found it, in the ash bin behind the garden wall. I thought Cedric had dropped it. I meant to return it." "But you didn't." "No, I was curious." "Did you enter the laboratory?" Charles looked around, then said, "Yes, for 5 minutes. The door opened easily. I didn't touch anything." "Did you see the device?" "No, there was just a velvet case. I assumed it was in there." "You realize how it looks?" "I didn't poison him, Inspector. I wanted money, not murder." Price eyed him coolly. "Where is the key now?" "I left it on the desk in the East Wing." Inspector Price exhaled slowly. It was a mess of half-truths and disappearing objects. But there were patterns forming, Lady Margaret and Charles conspiring, a missing invention, and a poison prepared by a skilled hand. What he needed now was motive, and time was running out. Chapter 5. The Man from the Patent Office. Inspector Harold Price stood beneath the great portico, sipping lukewarm tea from a delicate porcelain cup, his thoughts as stormy as the weather had been the night before. The case was shifting beneath his feet, but it was the telegram that occupied Price's mind this morning. Lady Margaret had mentioned it, a visitor scheduled to arrive, a man identified only as Mr. M. And then, Almost as if summoned by fate itself, a motorcar pulled up to the drive, just as the clock struck 10. A well-dressed gentleman stepped out, brushing travel dust from his brown overcoat. He was tall and clean-shaven, with steel-grey eyes and an impeccable Windsor knot. He approached the door briskly and rang the bell. Withers, the ever-watchful butler, answered, his expression betraying only the faintest curiosity. "I'm here to see Sir Cedric Greaves," the man said crisply. "I believe he's expecting me. My name is Mr. Alastair Dean, Patent Office, London Division." Withers hesitated. "Sir Cedric is not receiving visitors at the moment." Dean arched an eyebrow. "Then may I speak to whomever is in charge?" A few minutes later, Inspector Price met Mr. Dean in the drawing-room, now cleared of guests. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the mahogany floor. "I'm Inspector Harold Price, Scotland Yard," he said, offering a handshake. "Sir Cedric is dead." Dean's face paled. "Dead? But how?" "Poison, cyanide most likely. We're still investigating." Dean ran a hand down his tie. "This is extremely unfortunate and inconvenient. He summoned me just last week, requested an urgent patent review. Do you have the letter?" Dean reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a folded sheet on official stationery. Price unfolded it and read quickly. "To Mr. Alastair Dean, Patent Office, London Division. From Sir Cedric Greaves, Ravenleigh Hall, Hampshire. Dated October 17th. Mr. Dean, you are hereby requested to attend Ravenleigh Hall no later than October 21st, to witness and preliminarily record a patent application of significant national value. Confidentiality is paramount. You will observe a functioning prototype and review documentation under sealed conditions. Sir Cedric Greaves." Price folded the letter thoughtfully. "So you were to evaluate the invention. Any idea what it was?" "Only vague hints. Something mechanical. Cedric was always obsessed with perpetual motion." "You've worked with him before?" "Years ago, during the early wireless telegraph experiments. But we haven't spoken since. This came as a surprise." "And yet you came?" "I'm a civil servant, Inspector. When someone with Sir Cedric's reputation requests confidentiality and urgency, one listens." Price leaned forward slightly. "Tell me honestly, Mr. Dean, were you the only one contacted by Cedric regarding this patent?" Dean hesitated. "No, I believe he may have alerted someone else in the government, possibly the Ministry of Defence, but they operate in their own shadowy way." Price had suspected as much. Alfred Kemp, the so-called Ministry Observer, was no ordinary visitor. There were more eyes on this invention than met the eye. Would Cedric's invention have military applications? Certainly, if it worked. Dean paused. If the machine could produce self-generating energy without fuel? Well, think of the implications. Submarines that never surface, radios that never need charging, even locomotives that could run across continents without refueling. "Power," Price murmured. "True and terrifying power." Dean nodded. Later that afternoon, Price summoned Alfred Kemp once again, this time to the study, where the fire had been relit and 2 decanters sat untouched on a tray. Kemp arrived with caution in his step. "I assume you've met Mr. Dean?" Price asked. "I have. Briefly during a patent review board 2 years ago. You told me you were here as an observer, but you failed to mention that Cedric specifically requested Mr. Dean's attendance. Why?" Kemp's mouth tightened. "Because my role was unofficial. The ministry has no formal link to Cedric Greaves. I was here as a precaution, not a participant." "A precaution against what?" "Espionage." The word hung in the air like smoke. Price raised an eyebrow. "Espionage?" Kemp leaned forward. "There have been whispers for months that certain continental powers are looking to poach British innovations. Cedric's device was on a list of interest." "So you were sent to watch him?" "To monitor the chain of custody," Kemp said calmly. "If the device was ever completed, it would need to be secured." "But now it's missing." And Cedric is dead. Kemp's face was grim. Exactly. After Kemp had gone, Price returned to his journal and flipped through his notes. Timeline. Cedric seen alive at 12:45 p.m. on Monday. Coffee brought at 1 p.m. Study locked. Body discovered around 2:15 p.m. Cyanide suspected. Device last seen in laboratory. Now missing. Sir Cedric's scheduled demonstration for Friday. Telegram mentions Mr. M. Possibly Mr. Dean. Charles admitted accessing laboratory. Lady Margaret involved in coffee delivery. And now, a new question. Who knew about Mr. Dean's visit before Cedric died? Because someone had acted before Friday. They had struck early, killed Cedric, taken the invention, and possibly planned to pass it off as their own. That evening, as guests retired to their chambers, under the weight of unspoken suspicion, Inspector Price took a solitary walk through the manor. The halls creaked under his steps. He paused outside a locked door in the west wing, Cedric's private study. It had been searched twice already, but Price reached into his pocket and withdrew a small skeleton key. The lock turned with a soft click. Inside, the room was dark, but a faint scent of machine oil lingered. A single oil lamp on the desk provided light. Price moved swiftly, methodically, rifling through the drawers and compartments. At the very bottom of a cabinet, hidden beneath false lining, he found a leather-bound notebook, not catalogued among Cedric's other journals. The cover was marked with the word Obolus. Inside were pages of diagrams, formulae, and finally, a rough sketch of a metallic sphere mounted within a rotating gyroscopic ring. The invention. And beside it, scrawled in Cedric's own hand, patent to be secured via Dean. Trust no one, not even Margaret. Suspect Charles. Venn lingers too close. If this fails, destroy Obolus. Too dangerous in the wrong hands. Price closed the book slowly, the weight of truth beginning to settle. Obolus was the invention's code name, a device capable of changing the world or destroying it, and now in someone else's possession. Chapter 6. A Timed Betrayal. Inspector Harold Price now knew that Sir Cedric had known he was in danger. He had begun cataloguing his suspicions not in legal documents, not in willful declarations, but in formulas, margins, and equations. A man of logic, even in his fear. Price stood upright, pocketed the notebook carefully, and extinguished the oil lamp. The hall outside was silent, but the house no longer felt still. He returned to his quarters, removed his coat, and poured himself a glass of brandy. For the first time since arriving at Ravenleigh, a clear path was beginning to form in his mind. There had been two objectives the murderer had pursued: kill Cedric to silence him, steal Obolus to claim it, and the timing was everything. The next morning breakfast was a tense affair. Guests shuffled in one by one, their greetings brief, their eyes darting toward each other in suspicion. Lady Margaret arrived fashionably late, in a deep green silk dressing gown, looking imperious but distracted. Charles Greaves drank 2 cups of black coffee and chain-smoked by the window. Dr. Venn mumbled into his eggs, visibly hungover. Miss Eleanor Bray, however, was nowhere to be seen. Price noticed immediately. He left the table and instructed Withers to locate her. When the butler returned moments later, his face was ashen. "Sir," he said, "her bed was untouched." And the housemaid found this, by the service staircase. He held out a small square of linen, torn at the edge. Price examined it. There was a faint stain, bluish-grey, the colour of certain metal-based sedatives. "Alert the staff," he said sharply. "Lock every door. No one leaves the premises." He turned on his heel and began a rapid search of the manor. 10 minutes later, Price descended the stone steps to the cellar. The walls down here were lined with barrels of wine and crates of tinned goods, the air heavy with dampness and mildew. Then, behind a low archway, he saw a figure slumped on the ground. It was Miss Bray, her ankles bound, hands loosely tied in front of her, a gag discarded nearby. Her eyes fluttered open as Price knelt beside her. "Inspector." "You're safe now," he said. "What happened?" I think someone drugged me. Last night, I was in the laboratory, copying some notes. I must have left the door open. Something was in the tea I drank. Did you see who it was? She shook her head. I heard footsteps, that's all. Price helped her up carefully and escorted her upstairs, alerting Withers to bring warm broth and a blanket. As she recovered in the parlour, Price pulled out the obelisk notebook and placed it on the table in front of her. She gasped. You found it? In Cedric's private study. He wrote that you were the only one he trusted completely. Tears welled in her eyes. He never said that to me. Only that I should stay out of danger. You nearly didn't. That afternoon, with Miss Bray recovering, Price gathered the household in the drawing room. The storm had returned, and the sound of rain against the tall windows echoed like a drumbeat. All the suspects sat in various postures of wariness. Price stood before the fireplace, journal in hand. I believe it is time for the truth, he began. Sir Cedric Greaves was murdered, and his invention, codenamed Obelus, was stolen. What none of you knew is that he kept a personal journal, one where he noted his fears, his suspicions, and his list of potential betrayers. He turned to Charles Greaves. You, Mr. Greaves, had debts so great that you considered selling confidential blueprints to a buyer in Paris. Cedric knew. That's why he wrote your name. Charles stood. That's a lie. It's the truth, Price said sharply. I found the telegram he intercepted. You sent a cable to a man named Auguste Lenoir, a known intermediary in industrial espionage. Cedric was preparing to cut you out of the will entirely. Charles sat down slowly, face white as paper. Price then turned to Dr. Hugo Venn. You, Doctor, were perhaps the only person clever enough to understand how Obelus worked and how to use it. You and Cedric were rivals for decades. You argued with him privately the night before his death. It was a professional disagreement, Venn growled. You threatened him. A housemaid heard you. Even if I didn't kill him. No, Price said slowly. You didn't. He turned his gaze next to Lady Margaret. You were the last to see him alive. You brought him coffee. But what you didn't know was that Cedric didn't die from it. She arched an eyebrow. Someone else needed him dead and planted the poison in another way, not in the coffee. He pulled the small missing device from his coat, a brass canister, roughly cylindrical, recovered from a locked drawer in the workshop that morning. This is the heart of Obelus, but Cedric had rigged it, not just for energy, but for defense. A spring mechanism inside could be triggered to release cyanide gas, intended to destroy the invention if someone unauthorized tried to tamper with it. Price turned slowly to the final person in the room, Alfred Kemp, the quiet observer, the ministry man who had claimed to be watching. You had one task, didn't you, Mr. Kemp? Price said. Secure Obelus for the ministry, or perhaps for another government. Kemp's eyes narrowed. Be careful, Inspector. You came early. You saw Cedric's schedule. You knew he trusted only Dean to witness the patent. You realised he wouldn't let Obelus go quietly. Price stepped closer. You went to the lab on Monday. You activated the device, and when Cedric came to retrieve it, he unknowingly triggered the trap. You had rigged it to release the gas after a delay. He died in the study, thinking it was safe. Silence fell like a hammer. Kemp stood slowly. You have no proof. Price reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather glove, stained faintly blue, hidden behind a ventilation shaft in the cellar, right beside where Miss Bray had been tied up. A glove with traces of cyanide, he said. Yours, hidden in panic. I've already wired Scotland Yard. You'll be taken into custody before the hour is out. Kemp lunged, but Charles and Venn moved quicker, pinning him down until Withers and another footman could restrain him. The room exhaled collectively. Later that night, as the rain finally began to fade, Price stood once more in the study. The house was quieter now. The machine was recovered. Miss Bray would finish Cedric's work and turn it over to Dean at the patent office. Obelus would not vanish into the hands of foreign powers, nor would Cedric's genius die forgotten. Lady Margaret had retired without a word. Charles had vanished into his own shame. Venn, oddly, had poured himself a brandy and nodded to Price in an awkward, almost respectful manner. Price picked up the brass canister one last time. "A device built to save the world," he murmured, "and nearly used to destroy it." He turned to the fireplace where the flames flickered low and placed it back in the iron safe. Some inventions, he thought, should remain locked away. Chapter 7. The Clock Strikes Justice. The morning after the arrest of Alfred Kemp dawned brittle and clear. Price was seated in Sir Cedric's study, now cleared of its ghostly evidence, and reviewed the final reports delivered by the constables dispatched from the Alvercombe Constabulary the previous night. Alfred Kemp had been taken under heavy guard to London by the 7 p.m. train, where he would face formal charges of murder, espionage, and attempted theft of national property. The evidence was concrete: the cyanide-laced glove, the manipulated mechanism inside the obelisk prototype, Miss Bray's testimony, and the failed attempt to remove her from the equation. The hidden correspondence in Kemp's valise found after arrest, coded letters implicating contacts in Vienna and Berlin. It was not just a murder now, but a case that would reach the Foreign Office, the War Department, and perhaps even the Prime Minister's desk. Sir Cedric Greaves, the reclusive genius, had been right to fear betrayal, but he could not have known how close to home it would come, or how narrowly his life's work had avoided becoming a weapon in the wrong hands. That afternoon, Price called upon Lady Margaret Greaves in her private sitting room. She was dressed in black crepe, a mourning veil draped elegantly over her hair. A small fire crackled in the hearth beside her, and she held a letter in one gloved hand. "I suppose you've come to ask whether I was complicit," she said, without looking up. Price remained standing. "You were never my chief suspect." She looked up then, her eyes glistening but hard. "And yet you asked, more than once, about the coffee." "I did, but Kemp never intended to use the coffee. The murder had already been arranged. Timed, scientific, almost poetic in a way." "Cedric would have appreciated that," she said, with a bitter laugh. "You did love him, didn't you?" Lady Margaret stared into the fire for a long time before replying. "I did. Not in the way the poets describe, but yes, he fascinated me. He terrified me too. I came to this house for security, and stayed for something like loyalty. But he was always distant, married more to his work than to me." "You feared he would cut you out of the will?" "He already had," she said calmly. "The new draft was signed last Thursday. I saw it. Everything was to go to the British Science Trust, with a modest annuity left for me, out of courtesy." Price raised an eyebrow. "And yet you didn't fight it," she smiled faintly. "Because I have something more valuable than inheritance, Inspector." "What's that?" "My freedom." Price next visited Miss Eleanor Bray, who was seated at a small table in the library, sorting through files and documents. She looked stronger now, her face no longer pale, her movements purposeful. "They've asked me to come to London," she said, not looking up, "to help oversee the preservation and classification of Sir Cedric's work." "You deserve it," Price replied. She looked up at last. "Do you think he knew that it would end like this?" "He suspected someone was after him," Price said, "but not how soon they'd strike, or who they would hurt along the way." Miss Bray nodded slowly, her eyes misting. "I wish I could have saved him." "You did in a way. You preserved the invention. You kept his name out of disgrace, and you'll carry his work forward, if you choose to." She looked away. "I won't rebuild Obelisk, not yet." "Why not?" "Because no invention should be built with blood on its gears." Price then encountered Dr. Hugo Venn in the conservatory. The older man had remained in the house, under quiet protest, largely drowned in brandy and melancholy. "I suppose I owe you a word of thanks, Inspector," Venn said, lighting a cigarette. "You've spared me a lifetime of suspicion." "You were difficult," Price replied evenly, "but not guilty." "Not of murder, no," Venn said, "but I envied him, Cedric, for all his brilliance, for the machine. I might have stolen it myself, given the chance." "But you didn't." "No," Venn agreed with a hoarse chuckle. "I was too proud, or too slow." Finally, Price stepped outside, where the gravel path curved around to the old sundial Cedric had once used as a navigation reference for his experiments. The sky above was clear. Birds had returned to the hedges. The manor looked peaceful again, though it would never be quite the same. Charles Greaves approached from the edge of the garden, hands in his coat pockets, his face gaunt but less wild. "I'm leaving," he said simply, "heading to London." Price nodded. "You have your freedom. But if I were you, I'd use it wisely." Charles nodded. "Funny, isn't it? I spent years trying to outrun my uncle's shadow. Turns out I couldn't even step out of it without tripping." Price studied him. "He saw more in you than he let on. If he hadn't, he would have cast you out long ago." Charles looked away. "Perhaps. Doesn't change what I've done." "No, but you're still alive, and that gives you a chance to change what you'll do next." With that, Charles walked away down the path, vanishing into the sunlit distance, like a man unsure if he was leaving home or running from it. Epilogue. 2 days later, Inspector Harold Price sat aboard the London-bound express, Ravenleigh Hall, shrinking behind him into a dot on the Hampshire landscape. Beside him sat a case containing the opalus prototype, safely sealed and to be delivered to the patent office. A second file, labelled Classified National Security, Ravenleigh Case, rested under his arm. As the train gathered speed, Price watched the countryside rush past. Another case closed, another death explained. But the truth of the matter stayed with him. Not everything could be solved by logic. Some crimes were acts of ambition, others acts of desperation. But this one? This had been a betrayal timed to the second, with gears of murder turning beneath the illusion of civility. And yet, the murderer had forgotten one crucial truth. Justice, too, has a clock, and when it strikes, it does so with precision.